Hi, welcome back to the Z-fari video novel. We're going to read the third section in the 8th chapter. This is probably my favorite section. I had a really good time writing this. I hope you enjoy listening to it and reading it as much as I had writing it. But anyway, Sergeant Earhart is looking for replacement agents for the Border Patrol to go after the zombies. And she's in the midst of her interviews, and she comes across an interesting young man. If you're ready, here we go. She got back to her desk just before 1 and had enough time to straighten her desk and bring up Trooper Tolan's file, or more accurately, empty space on her computer. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," Sergeant Earhart said. Tolan opened the door and walked quietly in to stand in front of her desk. It was hard for her to tell how tall the trooper was, maybe a little less than 6 feet, maybe not. He wore medium gray jeans and a lighter gray polo shirt. His charcoal gray running shoes had grayish black laces. He wore his light gray hair medium length, and his deep gray eyes looked out of an unhealthy looking grayish complexion. "Please sit down, Trooper," she said. He did. "Tell me about yourself, Trooper," she said. "Not much to tell, ma'am." "Okay, where were you born?" "Not sure, ma'am." "Where'd you grow up then?" "Around, ma'am." "Around?" she asked, really trying not to lose her temper. "We drove around in the car, ma'am." "With your parents?" "No, ma'am." "Who were you with then?" "Just Tolan, ma'am." "Your father?" she asked evenly, trying not to sound as exasperated as she felt. "He never said, ma'am." "What was his first name?" "He never said, ma'am." "Where was your mother?" "I don't know, ma'am." Okay, then. Earhart was getting nowhere fast. Let's try another tack. "Where did you go to school, Trooper?" "I didn't, ma'am." "So you're homeschooled?" "No, ma'am." "Where'd you learn to read and write?" "I didn't, ma'am." "Trooper, you filled out an application to join the patrol. You learned how to read and write somewhere." Sergeant Earhart was losing patience with this infuriatingly laconic prick. "I just did it, ma'am." "You just did it?" Earhart slowly spat out each word. "When I was old enough to be alone for a while, I was probably about 3 or 4, Tolan would leave me in a library in wherever town we were in. He told me to be quiet and that he would be back to get me after work." Now we're getting somewhere, she thought. "What kind of work did he do?" she said. "He never said, ma'am." She almost growled in frustration. Tolan saw this and volunteered. "There were lots and lots of books in the library, ma'am. Some had pictures. I liked those. A lot of the pictures had little lines below them. After a while, I figured out what those little lines were." "Who taught you to write?" "I saw people doing it at the libraries, ma'am. I figured it out." Sergeant Earhart had never ground her teeth before meeting Tolan. She suddenly realized that she had been grinding her teeth ever since Tolan had begun talking about the libraries. "So where'd you learn to shoot, Trooper?" "Tolan kept a .22 rifle in the trunk, ma'am, for a rabbit for dinner every now and then when we weren't near a town or with a store. He took me with him whenever we went hunting for dinner. I guess he thought leaving a little child alone in a car wasn't safe. I watched him. One day, when I was about 7 or 8, he handed me the rifle and told me to go get something to eat. He took a nap. I brought 2 rabbits back." "Where's Tolan now?" "Well, ma'am, one day when I was maybe 12 or 13, I woke up and looked over the front seat. I always slept in the back seat, and Tolan was lying on the front seat. I got out of the car to, well, do my business. When I came back to the car, Tolan was still asleep. I waited for him to wake up. I waited till noon. I opened the front door and reached in to shake him awake. He was cold and a little stiff. I realized that he was dead. I pulled him out of the car. He was heavy as lead and over and under a tree. I went through his pockets and found $326 and the keys to the car. I went back to the car, got behind the wheel, and turned the key. It took a while, but by the time I got to the Mississippi River, I was a pretty good driver, better than most of the other people on the road." "Go on, Trooper." "Yes, ma'am. I had driven to St. Louis, but I was getting low on money and having to put gas in the car. I drove around town till I came to the docks at the port. There were lots of people, loading and unloading big ships. I saw one that was busily loading the Thomas P. Leathers, and I joined the line of men carrying sacks of something from a tractor trailer to a big pallet waiting for a crane. When that pallet was full, a man hopped onto it, and the crane lifted it up onto the ship. It looked like fun. So when I'd helped load the next pallet and it was just leaving the ground, I hopped on and rode it up and onto the ship. Earhart could only nod. When I jumped off, a big man walked over to me and asked me what the hell I was doing. He told me that he had watched me load the sacks and then ride the pallet up. I told him that I needed a job. He looked me up and down and asked my name. Tolan had just always called me Mickey, so I told him that I was Mickey Tolan. The big man thought for a moment and told me to follow him. He led me down a confusing maze of ladders and through metal corridors. Finally, he came to the purser's office. We went in. "What's this, Collins?" the man I later came to know as Mr. James asked. The big man, Collins, asked if there was a job for a steward. Mr. James looked through a big book on the metal table that served as his desk, thought for a moment and said, "I believe that there is. Is this our new steward?" Collins introduced me as Mickey Tolan, and I signed the paper he gave me. Mr. James told me that the ship would be leaving port at 8 a.m. the next day and to report to him then. I thanked him and followed Collins back up to the deck. Collins said to me, "Everyone needs a chance once in his life, Mickey. Here's yours." He held out his hand and I shook it. Then he showed me how to find the gangplank and leave the ship. I had some things to take care of before the next morning. I went back to the car and looked through the trunk. Beside a pile of tools, 2 small sandbags, a coil of rope, and a couple of cans of oil, there was a rifle and 3 boxes of ammo. I took the rifle and ammunition and laid it on the front seat next to me. Then I looked in the glove compartment. There was a pistol, a .22. It took the same ammo as the rifle. The title, a couple of maps, a small folding knife, and some loose change. I put the folding knife and the change in my pocket and the pistol in the front seat next to the rifle. I turned on the ignition and drove off looking for an Army surplus store. I found one within 10 minutes. I put the rifle and the pistol back in the trunk and locked it. I went into the store. I needed some clothes. I found a barber waxed sapper jacket, a couple of pairs of pants, a couple of shirts, some underwear and some socks, and a used but serviceable pair of work shoes. I paid for them and left, getting back into the car, looking for a pawn shop. I was less than a block from the surplus store. I went in and found a shoulder holster for my pistol. I got back into the car and drove back toward the port. I knew that I needed to get rid of the car and the rifle. The seedy streets and alleys near the docks seemed like the perfect place to do that. I saw a bunch of men in an alley. I drove past. As I passed them, I noticed that there were boxes of something on the ground and the men were passing money to each other. I pulled over and got the pistol out of the trunk and loaded it, sticking it in my belt behind my back. I took the firing pin out of the rifle. Then I took the rifle in hand and walked down the block toward the alley. The men in the alley stopped talking and turned toward me when they saw me. I was scared, ma'am. A skinny little man turned to a bigger man and said something I couldn't hear. Then he walked over to me, grabbed the rifle out of my hand. "What's this, Sonny?" he asked. "It's my granddaddy's rabbit gun, mister. Do you want to buy it?" I asked. He laughed an ugly laugh, and the other men laughed too. "Don't see how I have to buy it now, Sonny. I've got it right here in my hands." I pulled the pistol from behind my back and stuck it in his face, about an inch from his right eye. "Well, mister," I said, "if you want to keep that rifle and your eye, give me $200. Just drop the money on the ground." He was shaking a little and said, "I don't have $200. Just throw whatever money you've got on the ground," I told him, "and maybe your friends could chip in to help you out." He reached into his pockets and emptied them. Bills and coins hit the pavement. "Lenny, Spike, Larry, come on, put your money on the ground. We can get this little bastard later." His friends added to the money lying in the alley. I moved the barrel of the pistol slightly to my left so that its line of sight just missed the side of his head. Then I pulled the trigger. The little gun boomed. The casing flew past the man's nose. Gunpowder hit him in the side of his head and the top of his right ear. His friends scattered, and the little man dropped the rifle and staggered away down the alley after them. I picked up the money, almost $600, including the change, but left the rifle on the ground. I went back to the car and drove back to the docks. I went aboard the Thomas P. Leathers that night. "That must have been 20 years ago, Trooper," Sergeant Earhart reminded him. "Yes, ma'am. I worked the Mississippi for a few years and wound up in New Orleans. I learned to cook and most of the other jobs on deck and in the engineering department on the river. In New Orleans, there are a lot of little and not so little freighters plying the Gulf of the Gulf and the Caribbean, and even traveling to Mexico, Central America, and South America. They didn't care what name I called myself as long as I did my job and could fire a gun and hit what I was aiming at when the pirates came alongside. When the zombies took Kansas, I thought that I could help. Trooper, Sergeant Earhart asked, is any of that story true? Oh, yes, ma'am, Tolan said, looking shocked that she would ask. Okay, then. Is most of that story true? I guess I can't say for sure, ma'am. Emily thought that she saw just for a second a hint of a smile at the corner of Tolan's mouth. Thank you for sharing your story with me, Trooper Tolan, Sergeant Earhart said. It was my pleasure, ma'am, he said. You are dismissed. Trooper Mickey Tolan, or whoever he was, stood, turned, and walked out of her office. He would be back on his platform tomorrow.